Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0, featured on the Whole Care Network and on UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. I'm your host and presenter, Christopher McClellan. You just might know me as the Bowtie Guy. On this episode of Healing Ties 2.0, I am thrilled to introduce you to my new friend, Sam Timbrook. Having served as a pastor and public school educator, Sam's life's changed when he became a caretaker for his wife and child. Holding a master's degree in counseling and a doctor of ministry, Sam, like many of us, was not prepared for this life-changing responsibility called caregiving. As a board-certified master mental health life coach, Sam has created a nonprofit program focusing on those who are caretaking and dealing with grief. I know you're going to enjoy my conversation with Sam as much as I did. Let's join our conversation, and we'll see you on the other side of the podcast. Well, greetings, Sam, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0. It is a delight to visit with you today.
I've been looking forward to this. I appreciate the opportunity.
Likewise, we're kind of we're from the home state of Missouri, even though I'm in Florida now. And do with all my guests, Sam, I start out by asking, how are you creating Healing Ties?
I'm creating Healing Ties by attempting to look at the whole picture of caregiving. Some people want to take the educational approach, some the mental health approach, some the spiritual approach, some the physical approach. I take it all. And it's helped me heal by learning more and more that maybe what I'm going through as a caretaker, the feelings I have, the emotions, the behaviors are just so typical. I follow a 3N pattern. I say it's natural, it's normal, but it's also necessary.
Natural, normal,
and necessary.
You're right on target there.
I hope so. That's going to be the title of That's going to be the title of my 5th book. Of course, I've not written my first 4 yet, but that's going to be the title. It's going to be the title of my 5th book.
Well, you've got at least you have a start. You have the title, but no, but natural, normal, and necessary. I've had the privilege of talking to caregivers all over the world, and nobody's quite put it like that before, because caregiving is a natural thing that we all end up doing.
Right.
It's normal in a lot of senses, and it's necessary.
Yeah.
And I know that you've had 2 caregiving experiences that we're going to talk about today. So I'm just kind of leading you into your caregiving story as well.
Well, my wife and I have 2 fine sons. The second one was born with what we used to call multi-handicapped. In other words, he had a variety of issues. It was quite the shock because we had the best specialist in town, and my wife had the amniocentesis and the ultrasounds and all those things. But when he was born, it was obvious he had a lot of problems. And so he, as a result, spent the first 3 months of his life in intensive care. And then at one point, the medical profession said, maybe you ought to look at institutionalizing him. And they advised us not to take him home, but love said, take him home.
Right.
And we had him for 40 years. He went far beyond of what they thought he would physically. When he passed, he was probably functioning about a 7 or 8-year-old, something like that. But his main condition was a condition called myotonic dystrophy. But from the moment of birth, he had to be cared for. And even as an adult, he couldn't, well, let me just put it this way. He couldn't care for his own bathroom needs, couldn't bathe himself.
Mm-hmm.
He could walk some. He spent most of his time in wheelchair. We were blessed to have an outstanding local public school, and he did graduate from high school as a a special skilled child. But the last year of his life, he spent 52 days in the hospital. But except for those days in the hospital, we had to take care of his every need. And then my wife, although she had some health challenges over her life, when she turned 60, she rapidly developed some problems, and she was also diagnosed with this same myotonic dystrophy.
Oh, goodness.
Which is highly unusual at that stage in life. Mm-hmm. But it also kind of explains some of the medical issues she had in her earlier years. But her last 2.5 years, she either was in bed or in a wheelchair, tube fed. She couldn't care for her hygiene needs or bathroom needs. Without getting too graphic, she even had some special female needs that I had to take care of. And then her last 3 months, she just rapidly went downhill. But so for a while, I had two. And then after my wife passed for a few more years, like I indicated, my wife died 8 years ago, my son 3 years ago. For a few more years, I had one. One who was with me and two who were in my heart.
That was very beautifully said, Sam. I think one of the reasons why I'm really honored to talk to you and hear your story is there's this misunderstanding is not the right word, but there's this thought that caregiving is just for people that are older, that it's an elderly issue, but I would venture to guess, and I don't have children, but I'm a favorite uncle to 25 nieces and nephews and 40 great nieces and nephews. But I'd like to just kind of chat a little bit about that experience when your son is born and you grasp it, as a child grows, you're certainly a caregiver per se, but this is taking caregiving to the next level for a child. And I really appreciate you kind of sharing those thoughts and feelings about that as life progressed for you and your wife and your son.
When we brought our child home, everyone had an opinion about his problem, what it was. Mm-hmm. Grandma said, well, he's just like your cousin, and he had a late start, and he's doing fine now. A fellow pastor, I say fellow pastor because I've pastored churches most of my adult life, as well as being in school psychology. But anyway, the pastor said, well, it's God will heal. Don't worry, God will heal. And everyone else had an opinion, but not until he was 2 years old did it hit us. We had a child with special needs. And I never will forget that one of our friends who was, to quote someone else, they were like a velvet colored brick. They could really say some things out of love, but boy, did it hit. And that person, when we realized our son was always going to be special needs, short of a miracle, she said, I was wondering when you would learn that, I was wondering when you would realize that. And then out of the clear blue, we moved to another little town. And one day we had a knock on the door, and these two ladies were there. And they said that they were from the local cerebral palsy school. They had heard that we had a child with special needs. They'd like to talk with us about maybe doing an assessment and see if their program could assist. And they were lovely ladies, and we talked. But as soon as they walked out the door, my wife and I looked at each other, and at the very same moment said, why did they come? Because even the Mayo Clinic told us our child was delayed. What does delayed mean?
What does what does that mean?
That
Right.
means, the other day I was supposed to be at a meeting at noon. I got there at 12:15. I was delayed, but I got there. So, but anyway, long story short, we went on a pilgrimage and went to several different doctors all over the country and things like that, and got him in the CP school, cerebral palsy school, and things like that. But every time he should have done something because of his chronological age, but couldn't because of his disability, we went through grief. And our caretaking became more and more overprotective. I would be the very first one to tell you we were overprotective.
Mm-hmm.
But we saw what happened to some children with special needs who weren't overprotective. And we determined we were
Yeah.
not going to allow that to happen to our son. But for example, when our son turned 5 and he wasn't going to a traditional public school for kindergarten, we grieved. And it's the same way when he should have been riding a bike, when he got older, the same way when he should have been, flirting with the girls. I mean, all those things we grieved over and over and over. And the grieving is a part of that normal, natural, necessary. Because until we
Oh,
realized what we were
yes.
doing,
Right.
until we realized we were in grief, or when we did realize it changed our perspective. Now, when I say in grief, we didn't go around talking about, oh, how bad it is, and you don't realize what we have to do. I mean, we weren't that kind of people, because we did see growth, but nowhere near what it should have been. I'm talking about physical and
Got
and
it.
cognitive and things like that. So sometimes our caretaking included embarrassment. We'd go out in the community and people would say, "Oh, how old is he?" And we would tell them. They go, "Oh." Or one time when he had ear surgery and we were going for a follow-up visit, and the nurse, our son's name was Ryan, the nurse would say, "Well, Ryan, how old are you?" And Ryan said, "I'm 29." But he spoke like he was a 6-year-old. And the nurse said, "Oh, I'm 29 also." And I thought, "No, you're not." And then I thought, "Yeah, by the time you're 29, you are a nurse, you are a farmer, you are a teacher, you're a business owner, you're a stay-at-home parent." And
Mm.
and so caretaking involves a lot of grief. And I think that some of us, when we are caretaking, if we're not careful, we can almost put a cocoon around ourselves
Right.
to try to avoid the pain.
And it happens without us really recognizing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You had mentioned before we started, and you'd mentioned another wonderful term in a sense that I'd not heard before, grieving the living. And I even though we've been chatting now for 15, 20 minutes, this grieving the living, I had not really had heard this before. And it's really touched me as I look back on my caregiving experience. I'd love for you to expound a little bit about what you mean by grieving the living, because I know our listeners are going to love to hear
Yeah.
this.
When our child was 5 years of age, my father died, and he was the first close member in my family who had passed away. And some of the emotions and some of the feelings I had around his death, my dad's death, I kept saying in my mind, I have felt this way before. But where? But, with whom? And I asked my older brother, I said, has there been any other family members who've died? No. We've had distant cousins and uncles and aunts we never met, but as far as close. And after a lot of thought, and I'll go ahead and say it, prayer and help of a school counselor, I
Mm-hmm.
realized that the grief I was going through with my dad's death, the reason I recognized it, I was going through it with my son.
Mm-hmm.
And I was grieving while he was alive. And there were so many similarities, because when you are a caretaker, you lose a lot.
Right.
And I know some people, I've actually had some people say, but oh, what a joy to know you're serving your loved one. Okay, I understand that, but it's still caretaking. And every caretaker I've ever known has lost something. They've lost their time, they've lost their health, which many caretakers do.
They lost their identity.
Lost their identity. They may have had to change careers. It affected my career and everything. So,
Sure.
but I don't think we know it's grieving. I guess you could say grieving the living or grieving while they're living. Grieving while you're caretaking. I don't know what the textbook would want to call it, but it's almost like death. And in one sense
We'll
of the
make
word,
our own textbook.
yeah, there you go. There you
Yeah.
go. And another thing we had to deal with, I did with caretaking my son, our son, but also my wife, especially my wife, because she was much more fragile than my son, is that some of these studies that are out there about grieving, they're just not right.
Right.
Even Kubler-Ross has said that she never intended for those, 5 stages of grief to be bump, 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 bump. I mean, it's more, I had a friend of mine said it's more like riding a roller coaster in the dark.
you took the words right out of my mouth, because that's kind of how I characterize my grief.
Yeah. But I think of the people who will watch this video, I think, and I'm not bragging or complaining, I'm just stating the fact. I think there's going to be yeah, that's what I'm going through as a caretaker. That's exactly what I'm going through. And I hope that all of them will do the 3 N's, knowing it's normal, it's natural, but boy, it's necessary. Because I think if you don't realize it's grief, necessarily realize it's grief, I mean, it can eat you up.
Grief has a way of eating you up, and that just binds you, and
Yes.
It it makes you make poor decisions. It stops you from stepping into your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I think and this is another area that I'm really kind of excited to talk to you about in a strange sense. So it relates to grief and men, because men deal with grief differently than women.
Yeah.
That macho man who, I can just blow off my feelings and it's okay. That's not the way to deal with something like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we men, we're fixers. Even though my wife, when she was healthy, would hide my tools, that's another video.
There's another story. I'm sure that.
But
she hid my tools.
We are fixers. We grieve. Some textbooks call it institutional grieving,
Mm-hmm.
where some people would say women do more intuitive. But I guess we were talking about grieving the living. I suppose one of my books I need to write someday, it should be called Grieving While Caretaking.
Oh, I could write a couple of chapters for you.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Goodness. And then caring for your wife. That pre-established relationship that had been there for years, and all of a sudden caregiving comes into the relationship. My listeners have heard me say this time and time again, but it might be the first time that you've heard me say this. Whether it's a spouse or a partner or whatever the relationship is, it's caregiving comes in, and it's almost like having two relationships in one. That pre-established relationship was there before the caregiving, and then caregiving comes in, and it not that it changes the relationship, but it often takes it to different levels. I'd really appreciate hearing hearing about your experience caring for your wife as well.
It certainly changes the priorities of your relationship. Having to care for her, she experienced some days very weak, fragile, but often she would express anger because mentally she was fine for up until the last 6 or 7 weeks. And she saw all these things she wanted to do, and she used to have just gorgeous penmanship. The first thing that left was her penmanship, and she'd get real angry over that. And she'd get angry that she couldn't do some things. And then, with all due respect, her family, her siblings, and her mother just didn't understand why we couldn't go to everybody's birthday party and the Thanksgiving dinners. And often I'd have to call up like an hour before the event and say, well, we just can't be there. And it really hurt her. It hurt my wife that her family didn't understand. And looking back, I'll have to admit, in an effort to protect my wife, I really didn't explain to her family what she was going through. So I have to bear a certain amount of responsibility there. And I think that's another thing in caregiving. Sometimes in order to protect the person we're caring for or protect our whole immediate family, we will, I'm not going to say we hide, but we certainly don't want the whole world to know. As I mentioned earlier, I work for school systems, but I also at the same time pastored smaller churches. And we would have some well-meaning people who would just show up on our doorstep wanting to help, which is wonderful. But I emphasize, please call. I mean, because if they just show up, she might be sitting in her wheelchair in the living room just with her gown on.
Right.
And she, or maybe I was in the middle of tube feeding her, which would take 30, 40 minutes to do. So she'd get angry a lot. And I know it was the fear of what may be coming, and the anger of what she could no longer do.
Right.
And but anyway, seeing her just waste away and her saying, well, why don't you call Dr. So-and-so? I just know I need this toe fixed, and maybe she did have a sore toe, but I would say, well, I'll call the doctor someday, because I knew the doctor would say, we're not going to do toe surgery on someone who we couldn't begin to do anesthetize her. And secondly, Sam, let's be honest, she's not going to be with us much longer.
Right.
And, she'd want to go to town and buy a new dress, and I couldn't even get her in the car. But one thing that we did do and she just kind of had a day where she felt better, even though she was in a wheelchair. She looked at her driver's license and said, oh, my license are due soon. She says, take me to the license bureau. So here I wheel in this lady. It's funny now. I'm sorry. You have to laugh. You have to find well, anyway,
right.
So we took her in and she did the vision test and somehow she passed that. Well, anyway, and of course they want to take your picture and they had her try to stand up, and the guy said, no. He says, we'll do it with her seated. But I can hear in the background people going, she's going to be driving, but she shouldn't be behind the wheel of the car,
Yeah.
And you don't know whether to just laugh with them or slap them,
Exactly.
Or just tell them off, or, and I thought later, if I had my brain in gear, I would have said, well, she's a lady mud wrestler. She's just resting or whatever. But anyway, but the anger she dealt with, and the times that I had to just say, hon, I know. And then she said, no, you don't. And I didn't. But, I was, in one way, I was suffering right along with her. But I'll tell you this,
Yeah.
and I'm not trying to sound syrupy sweet. I would not take $50 billion for what I've learned in caretaking.
Right.
But I pray every day I don't have to do it again.
Sam, I'm with you 100%. I believe, and I know we're aligned here. There's no greater honor bestowed on us than to care for somebody else, especially at the time when life transitions. Well, Sam, I think this is a great spot for us to take our break. And when we come back, I want to talk to you a little bit about your ministerial work. So, you're listening to Healing Ties, featured on the Whole Care Network and UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. We'll be right back.
Everyone has a story, but not everyone gets the chance to share their story. So, we're going to give you that chance. We want to hear about your story. We want to know how you're creating healing ties in your life and in your community. Email the bow tie guy at healingties.com and indicate if you'd like to be a guest on the show in order to tell your story. To your health, happiness, and prosperity.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We are continuing our delightful conversation with Sam Timbrook. And Sam, before we went to the break, I indicated I wanted to learn a little bit more about your ministerial background.
I went to college thinking I was going to be a high school band director. And near the end of my freshman year, an acquaintance of mine says, well, my little church that I go to needs someone to lead sing. Would you want to do that? So I did. And I did that my last 3 years of college. And the closer I got to graduation, I felt, I don't think I want to be a school band director. I think I'd like to be in church music. So after graduation, United went on staff of a rather large church in what a category we used to call in our denomination, minister of music and youth. And I wasn't in that position more than 6 or 7 months until I realized that my calling was really working in education, youth ministry. As I used to say, not the fun and games youth part, but not a youth activities director, but a youth pastor.
Brief pastor.
And so I went to another church with that emphasis of youth. And 2 weeks after I got on the scene, the senior pastor resigns. And I was called upon to do a lot of things the lead pastor, the senior pastor would do. And from there, really felt called into the pastorate. And so I did some more education. I decided I still needed some counseling education. So I got a master's in counseling. But anyway, long story short, I've always been a part of smaller churches, bivocational. At the same time, I did schoolwork. It's interesting, after my wife and I's son was born, we resigned a full-time church in order to have a working agreement with our denomination that on contract, I would travel the United States and speak to church groups and conferences and training centers, denominational colleges, about families with special needs members. But that wasn't full time. And so I also did schoolwork, went back into schoolwork. So for 24 years, I was in school and schoolwork, and depending upon what state you're in, I was either a school counselor with a mental health emphasis, or I was a school psychologist, depending just on whatever state it is. I asked a superintendent of schools once, what's the difference between what I'm doing as a school counselor with a mental health emphasis and a school psychologist? And the superintendent said about $15,000. But I retired from schoolwork 17 years ago, but I'm still with the church.
Right.
and still, and but my career changed because when our son was born, and as he needed more and more caretaking, it took both my wife and I to take care of him, and he physically was unable to travel very often, and so I had to stop my traveling. And I say in all humility, I was a sought after speaker for conventions, for training in the area of families with special needs or in area of grieving. I didn't know it then. I know it now that
Right.
I was often speaking about caregiving. I didn't connect all of that. And so after my wife died 8 years ago, I went on a search for information for grieving, especially for men. I couldn't find what I wanted. That wasn't the cookie cutter variety.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so I established my own 501c3 not-for-profit organization where I work with people online, especially since
So
COVID,
with COVID, everything's to
uh,
online. Sure.
and online, and also speaking. I'm much more available now to do speaking in view of the fact that, with all due respect to them, that my wife and son have both passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't do as much as I would like to. I hope it's not because I'm 72 years old. I think COVID has just changed the world as far as conferences and conventions
Right.
and
Yeah.
trainings and things like that. So, but uh, I just find that it's it's a ministry, it's an educational ministry, uh, but with each passing year, I realize more and more it's a caregiving ministry of helping people who are caregiving to experience, hopefully, the three ends.
The three ends. Yeah. So the parallel, pardon me, the parallels with caregiving and ministry are so clear as far as and uh, when that light went off in your head, and you mentioned it a little bit that you were really talking about caregiving.
Yes.
What what was the revelation there? What how did that feel when that light went off and you recognized that that's actually what you were talking about?
I really don't know whether I can say it wasn't a burden lifted. It didn't answer a question that I've had in my mind and in my heart. It was like a missing piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
When I realized it was caregiving uh, and grieving, the connection, uh, it was like, oh yeah, that's the part I've been looking for. That's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm helping other people cope with. Um, it was just like that feeling all the time, like you go through the day, and at the end of the day you say, there was something I'm supposed to do today and I just can't remember what it is.
Right.
Well, in this case of caregiving, it was like I've got all these pieces to my puzzle, and the pieces get shook up often,
Mm-hmm.
but that's what it is. It's caregiving. It's caregiving. Now, in one sense of the word, even though I'm sure some experts would say it's not possible, but right now I'm caregiving myself.
You must have been reading my mind what I was going to just ask you. Transferring care to yourself, especially
Yes.
after caregiving ends.
Yes.
It. I'm always prone to say, there's two common aspects to caregiving. There's a beginning and an end, and we're not prepared for either one of those life-changing events. And life after caregiving can be just as hard.
Yes. Both when you're caregiving for others and life after caregiving can be very, very lonely.
Oh, yes, it can be. Could be very lonely and prone to making poor decisions, emotional decisions.
Oh, yes.
Especially when you're in that cocoon where you don't really know where to turn. And again, that's another one of the reasons why I continue to do these podcasts and talk to awesome people like yourself, because if we just, it's our stories that break down barriers.
Yes.
And there's that. What's my phrase here? It's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And you could be left, right, black, white, gay, straight, or everybody has a story.
Absolutely.
And they all connect in the caregiving sphere to three words: love, care, and commitment.
Yeah.
Everybody understands that.
And one of the issues I had to deal with when I was caregiving, and to a certain extent, even now, since they've both passed, but when my wife and son were both alive and I was caregiving, there were a handful of people I trusted to stay with them for a short while, because I still attempted to pastor a church. I wasn't school teaching, but I felt guilty when I'd go out and get a steak.
Right.
In fact, there was a restaurant here in town that you go in and there's this little cubby hole back this way that you can sit back there and eat, and the people don't know you're there. And I would ask, is there a table back there? Because if I met someone that I really knew and here I was having a steak and my wife was being tube fed, I just would wonder, what are they thinking about me? And just this unrealistic false guilt that sometimes you have when you're a caregiver.
Our mind playing mental gymnastics on us. And no matter how much training you have, what the background is, it still happens.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
It still happens.
Yeah.
So what do you like to do for hobbies?
As simple as this sounds, particularly like on a day like today, I love to get in the car and just drive.
We have to be related, because that's what
I guess some people would call me a prude, because I even though I grew up on a farm, I really don't like to fish. I don't like to hunt.
Mm-hmm.
I don't play golf. I don't go drinking. But I love to travel. I wish I could travel more.
Mm-hmm.
Not only just for local recreation, but to travel to conferences and things. I used to thoroughly enjoy that.
Yeah.
I love to read. And some people say this is a waste, but I love to read. I love to watch the old sitcoms that as I watch them, I think, did I really think those used to be funny? But that's just what I like to do.
Finding time for yourself.
Yeah.
It's amazing if we could do that while we're in the midst of caregiving.
Yes.
I think
part of the problem,
easier said than done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, I hate to admit this, but I think part of the problem sometimes when we're caregiving about feeling guilty, worried about what others will say if we go to town to get a steak.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think maybe we thought some of those same things ourselves before we started caregiving about other caregivers.
Interesting.
You know,
Yeah.
that's false guilt. I know it. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe they are thinking that. But most days, not all, but most days, my attitude is, you know what? That's their problem. You know?
Right. If they don't like what they see, they don't have to look.
Yeah. You know, and those of us like myself who have been caretakers, and those who are in the ministry, and those who are in schoolwork, we tend to have personalities where we worry about what others think,
Right.
or we need to be needed. And there's that little voice, well, what if you do these things? Do you think that this so-and-so will still like, it's almost,
Approval.
and I know I'm picking on some people here, but it's almost like being a middle school girl. You just have all these, isn't that terrible? I didn't say that, but anyway, so that's where that, as the old saying goes, that's where it is.
So if you, and first of all, I would love to do a whole series of podcasts with you on these, on the topic of grief. And
no, I would be very open to that.
This is not the only time you and I are going to get together. I want to put that out publicly here on.
So is that a threat or a warning?
A little bit of both. But what would you tell somebody today that has just come home from a diagnosis of cancer, or that they're thrust into the role of a caregiver without any warning? What would you say to that person?
Don't be shocked with your feelings and your thoughts. But at the same time, don't let those thoughts and feelings control you. And I know that's easier said than done. But if a caregiver is not careful, we can think ourselves into a down trend.
Right.
It's so easy to do anyway as humans. But don't be surprised at your feelings. A lot of caregivers will say in their heart, maybe even say out loud, I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel exhausted. I shouldn't feel angry that this is the 8th time today she's messed her pants. Okay, can I be that graphic?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
And it's not that I'm trying to send a religion trip on people, but I think about those times even Jesus said to his disciples after he taught and he gave examples, and then finally he had to say, you guys just don't get it, do you?
that is spot on. Yeah.
Well, even at the Lord's, even at what we call the Lord's Supper, after he explained what was going to happen, and he said about the betrayal, they started saying, well, who's he talking about? They didn't have a clue, apparently. And, but like I said, don't be shocked with your feelings and your emotions. However, don't let them control you, and don't let them get you to the point that you may make some very poor choices. And that's easier said than done, because the system, whatever that is, where it's the school system, mental health, where it's education, physical health, whatever, they want you to make decisions right now. Right.
Make this decision right now. You
got to make it right now. And
I have to. It's okay to take a step back.
And it's okay to take a step back. And I would tell people, I said, now, when you tell that person that you can't make a decision right now, they'll say they may have a body language where they say they don't like it, and that's just their problem. I'd also tell families that there's a difference between moving on and just ignoring the problem. There's a difference between moving on and moving forward.
Oh, goodness gracious, St. Ignatius. We could do a whole show on that topic.
Yeah. And
Expound on,
a lot of that's mental.
We get it out, have to get it out of our head. It's again easier said than done, but when we can talk about it, it becomes just a tad bit easier. And we can certainly, I think we could help a lot of people by doing a show like that. I'd be honored to do that with you.
I don't know who said this first. I know I didn't. That's the only thing I know for sure. But I heard someone say one time about caregiving and a lot of other things in life, says you have to feel in order for it to heal. And I think we have to express it somehow, even though we may tell ourselves or others may tell us, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't be angry at that special little child. I know with our son, when we were caretaking him, it was so easy to say, well, he's special needs. We shouldn't correct him. And then finally, one day, a good friend said, that same person that I told you about earlier, that was kind of like a velvet covered brick,
right,
said, you probably will always have a disabled child, but don't let him become a child that nobody wants to be around.
Oh my.
So even though he was special needs and a lot of things he couldn't do, we know that when he would knock over a glass of milk, it really was accidental. It wasn't that big of a deal, but we still had to discipline him. And we still had to, when he was 3 and 4 and 5, he was physically able to go to town with us. And we would have to say, it's mom and dad's job to take things off the grocery shelves. It's not yours. And he didn't like that. But we had to say, we just don't do those things. But anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but I just, you mentioned earlier about we assume caregiving is for old people. When your caregiving is for a child, you still have to find out, all right, what do we do here for discipline? And you do it trial and error.
A lot caregiving is learn as you go.
Absolutely.
As I would imagine raising a child is.
Yeah. Every once in a while, because I'm always in search of books and articles and journals about caregiving. And when I read the profile of the person who wrote the book, and it's obvious they've never done caregiving, I don't want that book. I went to a support group once and I asked the person in charge, and bless her heart, she was a part of an organization. And since she was the new kid on the block, she got this job to be in this support group. It was a group for people who had lost a mate. And I just said to her one day, I said, who have you lost in your life? She said, well, I had a great grandpa die once. And I've had a couple of dogs and cats die, but that's about it. I never went back, And it's not that she wasn't a fine person. She's a fine person. But she just couldn't relate.
You have to feel it to understand it.
You have to feel it to understand, yeah. And when I started officially, I guess if that is such a term, caregiving for my son first and then for my wife, as a pastor, I felt like I needed to go back to all the people in my ministry who had done caregiving and apologize to them.
Wow.
For what I thought they should do,
mm-hmm.
And what I thought how they should feel.
That's a very powerful statement, Sam.
Yeah. But I did it. I hate to use the word out of ignorance, so I'll say I was uninformed. So that's me.
There's a whole lot. You see, we've already got our next 3 or 4 topics, and
How about that?
I think you've got 6 or 7 more books since we've talked today. So.
Well, you probably would have guessed that I'm a pastor, even without me telling you. I mean, I like to talk, but in all humility, I have something people need to hear.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
And I am so grateful for this opportunity today.
I likewise, I feel like I found a new best friend. So, Sam, let all of our listeners know how they can reach you through your 501(c), and at all the great information that you have. Please give out your contact information.
Okay. Well, my 501(c)(3), the official name of it is The Connection. I debated whether it should be Connection or Reconnection, but I've decided Connection. And the website simply is www.SamTimbrook.com. And that's SamTimbrook. Some people try to put an E on the end, but it's www.SamTimbrook.com. Email is sam@samtimbrook.com.
And we'll have all of Sam's contact information in our show notes that you can access on all your favorite podcast platforms. And Sam, with the great work that you're doing, you are certainly someone who's creating healing ties all around us. I can't thank you enough for sharing your story and your wisdom with us today. And I look forward to collaborating and working with you down the road.
Well, I would be honored. It is my joy. When I do things like this, I feel better. It's a part of my healing.
It's a part of, and that's what we're all about, is healing. So
yes.
Thanks, Sam, for sharing your wisdom on healing with us. And that does it for this episode of Healing Ties 2.0. I'm your host, Christopher McClellan. You might know me as the Bowtie Guy. I've created a life to love after caregiving ends by being with awesome people like Sam Timbrook and you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you for our final episode of Healing Ties real soon. Take care. Bye.